Happy Monday, everybody. I hope everyone had a great weekend. Today is Monday, August 23rd, 2021, and this is your Monday market update video. As I mentioned last Friday, there was a ton that went on last week, so we got a lot of information to cover today, so let's jump right in. Monday started with losses, as has been the case from overseas news. This time it was disappointing Chinese data and suggestion that the Delta variant was going to have some negative effects on global growth. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. There was also Afghanistan falling to the Taliban, but believe it or not, that had very little impact on the markets. The S&P 500 did turn at the end of the day and actually finished in the green, up about 0.25%. Tuesday brought about some more volatility with news of a New Zealand lockdown for their first case of COVID in over 6 months. The UK inflation was a little hotter than expected, and we had some earnings from some retail giants, Home Depot and Walmart. Basically they were not as upbeat as what the market was looking for. So the S&P 500 gave up almost 0.75%. That selling extended into Wednesday. Federal Reserve Bank of New Zealand actually now delayed an increase in interest rates that they had on tap. And they did that, of course, obviously because of COVID concerns. July FOMC minutes were out in the afternoon. They're pretty much as expected. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. The S&P 500 was down over 1% for the day. Thursday, we got some stabilization. We had jobless claims numbers that were a little bit upbeat, and that was offset a little bit by some negative COVID news. The S&P 500 was down early, but it actually finished up slightly for the day. Friday was a continuation of that reversal bounce that we saw on the S&P 500. We saw COVID problems as viewed as supportive of global bank action. Now, again, what does this mean? This is bad news is good news. We've talked about that a lot. And so the S&P 500 did finish up over 0.75% for the day. That put it for the week. The S&P 500 was down a little bit over 0.5%. The Dow was down 1%. The Nasdaq was down about 0.75%, and the Russell 2000 took it the hardest, down about 2.5%. Just a quick note, because why is this market continuing to be up near all-time highs when we've got all this stuff going on? We've got inflation, we've got Afghanistan, we've got the Delta variant, we've got economic data that's showing a little bit of a loss of growth momentum. So why are we still going up? Overall, I'm going to give you three main reasons we're going to watch, why we continue to be near these all-time highs. And if they falter, we're going to have to adjust. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. Number one, COVID vaccines are working. So yes, we do see some breakthroughs, but overall, COVID vaccines are keeping people healthier. And if that begins to change, then we'll have to reassess where we are. Number two, earnings. Now, we've seen this. You've heard me talk about it in the last couple of videos. They've been amazing. Earnings, almost all done with earnings season. About 88% of the companies that have come out with earnings have actually beaten expectations. We're already looking at over $220 a share S&P 500 earnings for next year. Those numbers are still probably going to go higher, but things are looking good. We're also hearing good bit of optimism from the companies. So overall, regardless of what we're hearing in the economic numbers, and what do I mean by that? So remember, we saw retail sales number. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but we saw disappointing retail sales numbers last week, but that actually hurt the markets last week. But the retailers, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Lowe's, those all had great numbers. So we're seeing their earnings come out strong. Overall economic numbers not always in line with that, so we'll have to see how that goes. And number three, the TINA trade. Now, TINA, there is no alternative. As we know, interest rates are low, growth is high, the amount of cash on the sidelines is huge, and that's just consumers as well as corporate, a lot of cash on the sidelines, some of the most we've seen in a long time. And there's few places for that money to go. So note, this is not the healthiest point to look at going forward in the longer term, but that's where we are right now, so we have to see how that goes. As I said, we're going to watch these three items. If they roll over, we're going to have to take some actions. So again, as we talked about last week, retail sales and FOMC minutes were the key news last week. But as of today, that's all history. The market's back up. We're going higher. Actually, retail sales last week, like I mentioned, disappointed, but only on the headline. Again, the more you read into it, the more you checked out what the details were, you realize it wasn't as bad as the headline looked like. So again, we'll have to see what that looks like next month when we get more of the Delta variant data that comes through, a little bit more high frequency in that regard. So in the Fed minutes, also the big news last week, much of a non-event it turned out to be, because it was a lot of the same stuff. We really didn't see anything new come from that. Again, also the idea that the Fed is meeting this week in Jackson Hole. We'll talk about that in just a second. That's sort of overshadowed the Fed minutes, because now we've got more current update stuff. So let's talk about that, the Jackson Hole Summit, and we'll talk about one other news item before we go for the day. First, the Federal Reserve announced late Friday after the close that the Jackson Hole Summit that we've been talking about for weeks is going to actually be held virtual. Now, think about this with me for a second. As you can imagine, if they're not willing to get together in person, do you think that's going to change the way they think a little bit about what's going on in the economy? I think it's going to make them think twice. The other big news also happened after the close on Friday, and it was confirmed this morning. The Pfizer vaccine was given approval by the FDA. So I'm not going to try to butcher the pronunciation of the actual name of it that it will be marketed under, but and I'm sure that this FDA approval is not going to convince everyone to go out and get vaccinated, but it is going to be interesting to see how that goes. What does it change for companies that want to line up and get everyone mandatory vaccines? So it does make a big difference in the pharmaceutical industry. It makes a big difference overall. So again, this week, the most important things are Friday. We'll get the Fed Chief Powell's virtual Jackson Hole speech. And again, most people think that we're not going to see a lot of news come from that, but we'll just have to see. And we'll also see the core PCI price index on Friday. Now, that is the key inflation measure that the Federal Reserve likes to see. So inflation is still our big number. So today is we're seeing right now a continuation of Friday's move without a lot of major economic news this week. Watch for some of the minor economic news to be picked up by the media and really pushed around. And then watch for things like FDA approvals, as we've seen, and see what that does, because you're going to see a lot of companies, I think, line up to try to make this mandatory. We just saw this morning New York City schools. Every teacher is mandatory for vaccines. So this will drive a lot of news this week and see how it goes. Just to remind you, my Friday videos is where we really focus on our planning, focus on putting our goals in perspective. Right now, we're doing a list of some of the things we need to make sure we do before the end of this year. So we're getting into those last few months of the year. We're going to take a look at that. So please tune in on Friday and check that out. Again, remember, this is the video that we talk about all the weeds. We talk about all the details of what's going on in the market. Fridays, we continue to focus on our goals into that long-term planning. So again, check that out. Feel free to pass that along to other people. Most importantly, stay safe. Have a great week.